Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 10 of the Red Sofa Conversations. Now, this episode is all about diversity and representation. I'm going to tell you a little bit more a bit later about what inspired this episode. But firstly, I would like to welcome my guest. On the Red Sofa today is Ade Hassan. Now, Ade is a new friend of mine. I actually saw her speak for the very first time in June at the Festival of Doers, an event that was run by Driven Woman. And from the first second that I saw Ade speak, or I heard Ade speak, I thought I have to get her on the red sofa. And I didn't know that we'd shared similar upbringings, being third culture kids, which is basically that we've grown up abroad. But yeah, it just seemed like she was the perfect fit to do this episode on diversity and representation. And so welcome, Ade. Thank you so much for being...
Thank you for having me.
For being on the red sofa with me today. Now, I think one of the first... When I pitched the idea to you, I had told you that this episode is actually inspired by the speech that I saw that Riz Ahmed gave at the House of Commons.
Yes.
And I rewatched this speech for all of you guys who haven't seen it. When I eventually post this, I think I'm going to put a link below because it is fantastic. I really, really think everybody should watch it. It makes you see him in a whole new light, and the points that he makes are so valid. Because essentially, when he talks about diversity, he kind of says that diversity is not just... where you have, he doesn't like the word diversity, and I tend to agree with him when I heard how he reasoned it out, because he said that diversity is not, it gives the impression that there is a core, which is the norm, and then you have to have a bit of diversity in there, which is like the sprinkles around it. So it doesn't really matter. Whereas the word that he prefers more is representation. And he made a very valid point, which is that it's very important for people to see themselves reflected back at them. So in movies, on TV shows, in books, they need to see people that look like them, sound like them, reflected back to feel like they belong and they matter. And when I heard Riz say this, I was actually quite blown away, because I grew up in Bahrain and Istanbul. So I was born here, but then I moved there when I was 3.
Yeah.
And in terms of television, I mean, I loved watching TV. I still do to this day. But in terms of television, the only Indian people or person that I saw was in Mind Your Language, which was a show made up. It was very funny, but it was made up of caricatures of different nationalities and races. And then there were black characters on Fame, the Jeffersons, and Mr. T and the A-Team.
Yeah.
And that was it.
Yeah.
And I guess it was something that I'd never noticed, because I grew up surrounded by different people. I was living in the Middle East in Bahrain, so I saw people who were, Bahraini, people who were Indian, Pakistani, then people at my school. I had a diverse range of friends, and that just exponentially increased when I went to Istanbul, because every single person pretty much in my class was a different nationality.
Right.
And so for me, I've always been surrounded by different people and difference and, diversity. And so I never really realized the effect of not seeing anybody Indian who was like me on TV. And I do wonder that had I seen that, would I have felt like going into acting was something that I could have done?
Yeah.
But it was something I loved, but I didn't ever see that as a possibility for me.
Yeah.
I don't know how do you feel about when you think about the kind of TV programs that you grew up with?
Goodness. I mean, I guess when I was little, it was all sort of cartoons and things. Yeah. So I was like, who cares? But we lived in Nigeria for part of my childhood as well. And so then obviously on TV, there was, some of the international things that you saw, and we'd watch Disney films and things like that. But then obviously there was also a lot of homegrown entertainment as well.
Oh,
And so,
okay.
you know, like news and then just Nigerian soap opera type things. And so so I grew up in lots of different places. Actually, I remember when I lived in Saudi Arabia, there was a lot, for some reason, I'm not sure why, but there was a lot of
American TV.
a lot of American TV, but a lot of Bollywood films.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I don't know why, but it was super, super popular.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you'd see like a lot of that. And so we just kind of watched. So I saw lots of different things, but obviously then being in Nigeria, I saw a lot of people that look like me on TV all
Right.
the time.
Okay.
And then obviously coming back to the UK, it was sort of switched on its head and, you know, similar to the stuff that you were watching. There's a lot of American TV and British TV. And so, I don't know, I guess I'd had lots of different images from media.
Yeah.
But as far as somebody that was specifically like me, I mean, that's probably a hard thing to fill anyway, just because it was, you know, of having such a different background. Yeah, I'd never, to be honest, it wasn't something that I ever thought about consciously when I was younger.
I think there's a lot of things that we don't really take on board because they are unconscious, and when we talk about representation, I mean, the thing that actually is important to note is that representation, it's not just about race. You know, I think that when we talk about representation, and I saw a clip of a speech that Idris made, and he sort of said, you know, it's race, it's sex, it's gender, it's being able-bodied, not as ably-bodied, you know, and I think that everybody wants to see themselves represented, to feel like they belong, because at the end of the day, I mean, I feel that the need to belong and feel part of something is in all of us.
I mean,
you know,
innate.
It's innate, right?
It's so powerful.
And I said this in a speech that I made last month, actually, that it's not that the need to belong itself is wrong. It's when we want to belong at the expense of who we are. And so it's finding the marriage between being able to be who we are and own who we are, and still feel like we're part of tribes and communities and groups, and because inherently, I think human beings, the greatest need is connection.
Yeah, of course.
So I've totally lost my train of thought. that doesn't happen normally. Yeah, so that's what. But going back to what we were saying before we started filming, that's, I guess, why it's London is a place that I absolutely love living in.
Yes.
Having grown up abroad and being exposed to so much multiculturalism, London feels a very natural place for me to live.
Yeah.
And do you feel the same?
Absolutely. I always tell people that London is the most cosmopolitan city in the world. And I'm like, you can look at New York and be like, yeah, it's really diverse. I'm like, no. London is cosmopolitan in a way which no other city in the world is, because it's a mix of absolutely everything. Like, I don't think there is anything that could truly shock or be foreign, quote unquote, in London to anybody, really. And that's across culture, it's across race, it's across religion. I mean, like, you know, you see people and people are like, oh, you know, if it's Happy Eid or Happy Holi, or, you know, just so many different cultures, and people are comfortable with it. And I know for me that was one of the reasons why when I left the US I was so eager to come back to the UK, but London specifically, because I'd had that background of growing up with so many different people and so many different cultures, and also in a relatively mono race, not culture, and when I was in Nigeria, and having experienced lots of different things, and then also being like very much the minority in places, it's like, you know what, London's great because there's just so many issues. London has its issues, obviously, but there's so many issues that I don't have to deal with in London.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm so glad that my parents picked London to sort of, for us to, you know, settle back in, because despite growing up abroad, England was always home for me. And I used to get really excited every summer when we do a lot of traveling, but we'd eventually always come back and spend, you know, a month in England. And the plane would land and we'd touch down and I'd feel, oh, I'm home. And one of my favourite things about London is, the hashtag London is open.
Yeah.
And I remember that especially, I was in Carnaby Street the day that we had the Westminster Bridge attacks. And in Carnaby Street there's a big globe and it said, London is open. You see it on the posters. And then this happened, and what I love the most is Londoners coming together. And they come together, and I feel like when there's tragedy or when there's celebration, they come together as one, and they reach out and they support each other, and that's the most important thing. And I was explaining to my niece, because she came over from Florida with her sister last summer, and it was great because we got to have lots of different conversations because they're growing up, so they were 8 and 12 then. And one of the things that she had asked me was, would you want to come live in Florida, because she wanted me to be nearby. And I explained to her that actually no, I don't want to live in Florida, and of course her natural question was why. And so I talked to her about how I was there at the time of 9/11, and I was very excited because I was going to be taking a 6-week trip around the States, and I had all of these plans, and then 9/11 happened, and it was obviously a time of great uncertainty. We didn't know what was going to happen, and my overwhelming feeling was I wanted to come home. But that was exacerbated by when I walked around, the day or two after, people were staring at me. And I had never been stared at in that way, where I felt, you could feel when people's eyes are on you and they're not thinking nice thoughts. I could feel it. And all I thought about is, I just want to come back home. And so I explained this to her. But, sometimes you can use words to explain things, and then you can go by a feeling. And when I was on the tube after, a few days after, I looked at down the tube carriage, and I looked around, and all I saw was just a whole load of different people. And so I whispered into her ear, do you remember our conversation from the other day? And I said, look at this tube carriage, what do you see? And she just looked, and she kind of went, I see lots of different people. And some people were speaking different languages, but it was undeniable that when you look around, it was a very multicultural tube carriage. And I said to her, that is the reason that I live in London. And so I think that, I'd like to think that certainly when people come here, they feel that.
Oh yeah, I think they do.
I think the Olympics also was amazing for London, because I think when people came and visited, Londoners, well, speaking for myself, I was actually a bit apprehensive before the Olympics, because I was like, oh my God, it's gonna, there's gonna be lots of people, and it's going to be impossible to get anywhere and everything. But there was some kind of, I don't know, effervescence. And I felt that Londoners, really welcomed the rest of the world into our city. I felt so proud.
I actually left. I was one of those people who was like, I'm not going to be in London when the crowds descend. And so I actually spent the summer in New York that year.
Did you?
But then all you saw everywhere was everybody talking about how amazing it was and how great London was. And I was like, what have I done?
But it did. Yeah. I mean, it was just, even just the essence of having conversation. I mean, I'm a talker, I like meeting people, and I wander, and I just start conversations with loads of different people, and it was just lovely because then you could give people tips about where to go, and you could tell them things to avoid or areas, and if it was going to be too congested, take this route. And I felt like there was a real joy. There was a real joy in the city, and I think that's the feeling, that's the prevalence that I think endures past something like the Olympics. As you said, it's a city that embraces difference.
Yes.
And when we talked about, what was that? Something fell. When we talked about representation, maybe it's a good time to sort of talk about why representation really matters, and what it does for people, both personally, but I think as a society.
I mean, I think personally, so I'm always so grateful that I was able to live part of my formative years really in Nigeria, where race was a non-issue. And so everybody that I saw looked like me. All the successful people looked like me. All the unsuccessful people look like me. The rich people look like me. The poor people look like me. The doctors look like me. You know, the maids look like, everybody looked like me. And so there was no limitations as far as me going, okay, as a, you know, young black girl at the time, I'm not allowed to do X, right? So, and that's a powerful thing. And I think sometimes when people are in the majority ethnic group in a country, so let's say if we're in England and maybe you're white English, you can't understand how powerful that is because that's your everyday. But then if you imagine, you know, for most of the other people who are like, you know, ethnic minorities, if you don't see yourself, as you mentioned, like on TV, or you literally have never seen a lawyer that looks like you, then you might, even if it's unconscious, it's like, oh well, then maybe
you sort of rule it out in your head.
Yeah, maybe that's not for me. And I know, and I'm so grateful again because I never ever experienced that, because over those years that I was able to see, there was nothing that was not for me. And so when I came back to the UK, we actually lived in Huntingdon, which is tiny, it's like tiny. Hartford, Huntingdon was tiny. We were the only like people of colour, not even like the only black people. We were the only people of colour. Like in my school, literally the only people of colour were me and my brother. And so that was, but then I was coming into that from a different perspective, where I was like, well, this is fine, because I mean, I definitely know that there's situations where that isn't the case. But it would be a very different story if I didn't have that. And I have friends who are, you know, who've sort of been born and raised here, who are minorities, and especially when I lived in America, because that's a different race situation altogether, really getting to understand race relations in the US and how just not, or even seeing, only seeing people who look like you in very specific scenarios, right, of what success looks like. So maybe you'd see, if you were African American, you'd see a rapper or a football player or a basketball player, and that was success. But then you wouldn't see
an Oprah.
An Oprah. But like you wouldn't necessarily see a judge. Or even if it was portrayed in the media, it was very specific types of, this is where you fit
being
in.
typecast, right?
Exactly. Or if you were Asian, then it was like, okay, you were a doctor, or you were serious and like, you know, the nerd. But like it was never like the comedian or the, you know, the funny person or the creative singer. Which things have changed a lot now. But back then, you know, you see, and it sort of reinforces certain stereotypes. Even if they're not negative stereotypes, it's still a stereotype. Yeah,
it's interesting because going back to what we were talking about with television, it's not just a case of seeing somebody who's brown on TV, because you can, and certainly when I came back, you know, I knew that, you know, goodness gracious me and East is East, and I saw that, but I didn't identify that with that. I mean, I think I watched part of East is East, and I've never seen goodness gracious me, because they might have been brown skinned, but they weren't me. They didn't speak like me.
Represented.
I wasn't represented. And what I get a lot of joy out of seeing now, I guess in the last sort of 20 years, is when you have characters on TV. So Parminder Nagra, not in Bend It Like Beckham, because race was a big part of her, and culture was a big part of her character, but where you see characters who their storyline isn't based on that. They just happen to be Indian, Chinese, black, whatever, but that isn't wrapped up into who they're portraying. So Parminder Nagra on ER, Archie Punjabi in The Good Wife, or in Departure. And so that's now, you know, more when I look at those characters, I kind of think, I see myself sort of reflected back. And Riz Ahmed did a few interviews, I think the Today Show and with Stephen Colbert, and he said that when he was growing up in Wembley, when he was younger, he'd be like, I'm British Pakistani. And he goes, and now he goes, I'm British. And he said, this is what British looks like. Me, Idris, whatever. And it's true, because I've always identified with being British above anything else, because this has always been my home, and I've strongly been drawn to the multiculturalism and the openness. And so, you know, I'm not an Indian religion. I'm Christian, not practicing, but, you know, I'm Christian. And I've been to India a few times, but not being an Indian religion and not sort of celebrating like the Indian festivals, I've never, you know, I've always felt very individual. And so it's nice for me now to look and to see the representation on TV. And I think that why it's so important is that it expands our perspective.
Exactly.
And while it's wonderful and it's important to celebrate uniqueness and to look at people's differences without fear, because it also shows you that you're more alike than you are different. So it's like, it almost feels like representation is two flip sides of the same coin. Yeah. It expands your awareness that there is difference, and let's approach that difference with curiosity rather than fear. But then it also shows you, God, underneath our souls, we are more alike than we are different.
Exactly. I was on a flight recently with a friend, and she's like, "Oh, what film should I watch?" And I said, "I've watched Crazy Rich Asians."
I love that movie.
And she watched it, and she was like, "Yeah, it was funny." She was like, "It wasn't like," she's like, "Everybody raved about it." But she was like, "It wasn't like an amazing piece of cinematography." And I was like, "You know what? I don't care," because it was funny, but also I was like, the mean girls were Asian, the like, you know, sort of like the crazy funny friend was Asian, the just everybody, you know, I was like,
it wasn't one-dimensional.
Exactly. I was like, it just showed how, you know, it was a romantic comedy, which if
it's a really good romantic comedy, and there aren't enough being made right now.
And I was like, if this was a predominantly white cast, it would have been like run of the mill, and it would have been like, yeah, this is like, you know, I don't know, maybe a Jennifer Aniston lead, like whatever.
Yeah.
Right? But I was like, but it wasn't. It was so many different characters, and they were all Asian, and it just showed how, like, it showed the diversity within a specific group of people.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's all well and good to have like the token, you know, like person who's like the diversity token, right?
Yeah.
To Riz Ahmed's point. But then that's still not representation.
Yeah.
And that's what I loved about that film. And it's the same thing with, you know, looking at Black Panther and stuff. It's just because people could be like, actually, I identify with that specific character.
Oh, and I'm probably one of the few people in the world that didn't like Black Panther.
Oh, no.
And not for anything more than I just didn't like the plot. Like, I didn't think...
I mean, it's the action hero movie.
Yeah, I didn't think the plot of the film was stellar.
Yeah.
But the character that I absolutely loved was his sister.
I knew you were going to say that, because she was like the best character.
She was kick-ass, and she was feisty and strong. And I remember watching that and thinking, God, that's going to be amazing for lots of young girls to look at that and kind of go, wow, I want to be like her.
Exactly.
Because when you expand what is possible, what you're doing is you're almost giving people permission to dream.
Yes. And
I mean, at our core, like, dreaming and striving for things is what keeps us alive.
Yeah.
It's what keeps us being curious and adventurous in life, and that's what keeps life being interesting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you do have maybe the 1% of people who, despite all odds, and maybe they haven't been exposed to anything, will say, I'm going to do X, and they can do it, even though they've never seen it, and they've never, you know, but most people do need to have some reference point. They need something to say, okay, actually I can do that. You know, they need that sort of spark of inspiration. Because sometimes I think it's very easy to be like, well, I don't understand why this person is X, or I don't understand why this person feels limited by Y. But then if you think about it, we probably feel that way because we've been exposed to X or Y.
Yeah.
But there's lots of people who maybe haven't, and so then it's a completely different perspective. Like, I think if I'd never seen, you know, if I'd never ever seen anybody who was an entrepreneur, would I think that was something that was possible for me?
Yeah.
Because it probably wouldn't even be in my line of vision, right? Like, you just wouldn't think about it. And so it is, to me, it's just hugely important, I think, to see yourself represented, and as you said, that might not even just be with regards to race, right? It could be with regards to gender, it could be with regards to sexuality, it could be in regards to so many things, but to feel some way connected.
And not alone.
Yeah.
Because when you see yourself represented, or you see somebody being curious about who you are, I think one thing that connects all of us is our stories. And we all have different stories, but I think it's in listening to each other's stories that we start seeing the common humanity in all of us. Because I know it sounds a little cheesy and sorry, but I really feel like, we need to start seeing ourselves as we're part of the human race. And when you see little pictures of, children who are different holding hands, or I remember seeing a really cute one of this little boy who must have been, 5 or 6. And he said, I got the same haircut as my friend, so now the teacher won't be able to tell us apart. And the friend was like a little, brown boy, and he was white, and they were just holding hands, looking with the same exact haircut. And they didn't see, that as being a barrier. And I think that's why, I don't know whether you've watched this, because I haven't, but I've heard it spoken about. There's a documentary on Netflix called Meeting the Enemy. And it was about a Muslim journalist that, because a lot of the reason that people are scared of difference is fear. Right? It's fear because you look at somebody, you see an obvious difference between the two of you, whether that be skin color or religion or whatever, and you feel disconnected. And so it cultivates the fear, and it kind of makes that fear even greater, because the fear prevents you from then having conversations and seeing somebody as actually human and like you. And so this journalist, very brave, she did not let that stop her, and she went and she started talking to people who were members of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups. And they, talked about things where they hated people who were like her. And the most incredible thing happened. Simon Sinek was talking about this. He said that when they started to get to know her, and not all of them, but some of them, their opinions were changed. It made them start to question their beliefs, because they couldn't reconcile having those beliefs about somebody who they then had got to know and regarded in some stages cases as a friend. And some of them actually then left those groups and were embraced. They went to a church and they told their story, and a lot of the people came and embraced them, and it blew their mind that they could be embraced by people that they had once hated. And it goes to show then the lesson from that, and of course everybody is different, but it does go to show that a lot of the things that keep us separate are fear and assumptions and misguided assumptions and misunderstandings, and that applies generally, it expands more than just this issue. But if we start trying to sort of open the door to have conversations, it will expand our human consciousness, what it means to be human as opposed to what it means to be one niche over another.
Exactly. I think exposure has a lot to do with that. I mean, I think generally speaking, a lot of minorities are exposed to white culture and white people because just it's a numbers game. But a lot of times it's very, very possible to live in the UK or a general Western country and not be exposed to any minorities. But I think it's a lot harder, as you mentioned, to hate people unless you have a very negative experience, unfortunately, with a specific,
and then, person. one negative experience, like people go, oh, I don't like the French, or I don't like, based on one experience. It's like, well, that isn't every single person. Let's put it in perspective.
Exactly. But I think sometimes when you are exposed to other, it sort of broadens your mind to being like, oh, okay, well, that person is human. That person is, that's my friend, and
that person's like me, and that person has the same worries and the same fears and the same, things that bring them joy.
Exactly, and it's not universal. There are some people who will choose to hate. That's across, that's anybody can choose to do that. But I do think exposure has a huge part to play in people becoming more accepting, more open, which is why I think London is so special in that sense, is because most people will have been, whether it's in school or work or whatever, they'll have been exposed to people who have a different culture than them or a different race than them. And so because of that, they're just more open to being like, oh, okay, well, it's different, but different isn't bad.
I mean, I've always felt that fusion is just sexy. Whether you're combining food or you're combining, fashion styles, or you're combining, mixed race relationships, which is another thing actually, making the distinction between London and New York.
Oh yeah.
London is incredibly, and it's not even tolerant. I don't like the word tolerant. It's accepting.
Yeah.
It's accepting and it's inclusive to mixed race relationships. And I didn't realize that New York wasn't as I don't know what it's like now, but I do remember hearing this story, and this must be quite a while ago now, but reading that Taye Diggs, who used to be married to Idina Menzel, she's white, he's black, they were having a baby, and they were both in shows, and they were getting hate mail to the stage door. She in particular was getting hate mail because obviously their child would be mixed race. And I remember being, and we're talking about, maybe 15 years ago, something like that, 15, 20 years ago. So still, in our modern times. And it blew me away that in New York, a city that I thought of as incredibly, cosmopolitan and, accepting or whatever, that was still an issue.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't feel that that's ever been an issue in London. I've got friends, lots of friends in mixed relationships. I've been also in mixed relationships, and then you see the second generation, and third generation, and it's so, London is a melting pot, and I think that's what keeps things interesting.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that for a while.
Yeah, no, again, I feel like London is sort of light years ahead of basically every other city when it comes
it's not like
the London show. We love London.
It's not like Sadiq Khan has paid us to do this, but obviously, as you can tell, we're totally in love with the city that we live in.
But yeah, that is just another symptom, I guess, of what you see in London, again, probably because of exposure and what's considered normal. And that's not to say that all mixed race couples are welcomed with open arms here. There's still
after Brexit, Riz Ahmed made this point that after Brexit, there was an increase in incidents.
Yeah.
I think I wish I could remember the stat. It's either 14% or 40%. I feel like I shouldn't misquote it. But then what he said is that against the Muslim population, it was 376%. And I do remember that. And I remember thinking, good Lord.
Yeah.
So obviously, there are things that we need to work on. And part of the way that we need to work on them is by talking and sharing and having, having one voice to counter the other voice.
Exactly.
So that at least people then have two voices to kind of go, okay, which way am I going to lean? And not just have, one story. One thing that I think is quite interesting is when we grow up in the world around us, I think that there are things that are part of that world, even tiny things, that we don't realize why they are a certain way.
Right.
Do you know what I'm going to talk about?
Plastic.
The plastic. So when I met Ade in June, I had literally just read this article, which is on the BBC website, and if you Google brown plasters, I think you'll probably find it. And it's, so we all get used to, apart from the funny cartoon plasters, plasters are this sort of pinky beige colour. And I have to say, I've never questioned it. And this article was this picture of this guy in America wearing a dark brown plaster on his finger. And he said that in all his 45 years, it was the first thing, he didn't realise that he would have such an emotional reaction from looking down at his hand and seeing this plaster matching his skin colour. And I think the brand there was True Colors.
Yeah,
Here
True Colour
there's
bandage.
Sticky Skins or something. I think maybe there's more. But it opened my mind, and I thought, oh my God, I've never even questioned how why the color of a plaster is the way it is.
Yeah.
And then, it makes you realize, wow, we have quite a limited sphere.
Yes.
Which is why I think Fenty Beauty, which has 50 shades, which is incredible, has been so popular.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it must be why you obviously have created what you created, because Ade, I don't think I even said this in the intro. Ade is the founder of Nubian Skin. So do you want to tell the audience a little bit about what Nubian Skin's about and why you created it?
Yeah, definitely. So Nubian Skin is a very, very simple concept. It's nude underwear and nude hosiery for women of colour. So I could never find sort of a nude bra. So if you go into John Lewis and you ask for a nude bra, it's beige. And obviously, or a nude slip, or a nude anything really. And my whole life, so like if I had a cute lace dress which had like the nude slip underneath, that just wasn't a look that was going to work for me, right? Because it's sort of like the contrast on the skin, or even something like tights. Just wanting to not look ashen, because there's like, what was this, barely black or like American tan were the options, and so they just, those are not skin tone colours for darker people. And so I decided to create a company that did multiple nudes for women of colour, and it's such a simple thing. It's a bra, right? Like bras or like pants, just so basic. But it was frustrating because I just couldn't. If I'd walk into a shop and ask for it, I was given something which would match my skin tone, or I was told you can wear black, which is not my skin tone, right? And so it is amazing some of the things that you take for granted. Then when you start thinking about it, you're like, hang on a minute, that doesn't work, and that doesn't work for a lot of people. There's a lot of women who don't fit into that mold of beige, and it's, and then when you mentioned the plasters, talk about underwear and tights, but it's simple things like microphones. A lot of actors wear. If you look on the stage, they usually have microphones. A lot of them are either just miscoloured, or if they're darker, they're wearing black as opposed to the nude colour, or they have to have
Never
it
thought
painted.
about that either.
They have to have it painted with foundation. Same thing with casts. The list goes on and on and on and on. And there's definitely, there's the default, which is white, and then everybody else is other. And you might not think about it consciously, but in a way it is alienating. At the very least, it's frustrating.
And then I think like, as you said, if you don't think about it consciously, then when you do come across it, I think that's when, as this guy, he said, I never even realized how much a little thing like that would bring me so much joy. And I mean, going back to underwear, I have never really worn nude underwear because I've never found nude underwear that actually
is nude.
that was nude. And again, I discounted it. I thought, I can't wear nude underwear, and so I would wear black and other colours. And with tights, there's only ever been one specific pair of tights which they've now discontinued.
Of course,
which I loved, and it was Boots Dream Skin Natural Tan. But Natural Tan was the only one that, like, when I looked from afar in pictures, it just about looked okay. And then Natural Tan is different between Boots and Sainsbury's and whatever. And so this is interesting. I want to come and like try on your products, because I'd be interested in seeing what it feels like to actually see something that looks more like me.
And that's a story that I feel like I've heard so many times. Like, we have emails from, a woman will be like, I'm 60 years old, and when
that makes me cry.
I know, but like, you'll have people who will be like, decades ago I found one brand did a brown bra or like a brown pair of tights and I loved it, but then they stopped and they were like, I can't believe that I'm seeing this. So you get somebody who's like 40 or 30 and they're like, oh my goodness, if only I had this when I was in school. or like I
Yeah.
can't believe that I'm 40 years old and this is the first time that I have something that matches my skin tone. And so people are, it's an interestingly, similar to the man who had, you know, that reaction with his plasters, it's an interestingly emotional thing when people are like, this works. This was made for me. This was made with me in mind.
Which means I matter.
Exactly.
Somebody has actually thought, I matter.
Yeah. And that's, and it's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing to know that somebody thought of you when creating something, or somebody like you.
What did it feel like for you when you first put on your products?
Yeah.
I
loved it.
Did you have that kind of, did you have an emotional reaction to it?
I was just, it was one of those things, I was just like, this is right? Like, this is how it should be. Because I, you know, as again, I mentioned...
I love that feeling.
But it's true, like, it's that thing of, you know, as I mentioned, when I was in Nigeria, it was like, race was just never a hindrance to anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so, something like that, being like, I can't believe a bra, like, for some reason, my colour is not nude, like, that shouldn't, like, why?
Mm-hmm.
You know? As opposed to, and I guess I'm one of those people, as opposed to, like, being accepting and saying, okay, well, I guess it's not for me, I was like, well, there should be one for me. And so for me, it was almost like a justification. If you're not going to do it, well, fine, I'll do it myself. But it deserves to exist.
I mean, thinking about it, my foundation, my pressed powder that I use, it's MAC, but I don't know whether you're aware of, but MAC do different lines for different countries. Did you know that? I
didn't know that.
Okay, so I didn't know that either, because I went to try and get my powder duty-free in America.
Right.
And I was told, no, we don't sell that here.
Oh,
So mine, which is a 44.5, is only sold in the UK.
So specific colouring is only sold?
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure a whole lot of money, millions went into the market research.
Have you tried on any of the Fenty Beauty?
I haven't. Actually, that's not true. I did go into a shop and like get swatched. But yeah. But I'm not like that. I mean, I know of it and I know like people rave about it.
Oh, really? Yeah, well, I mean, one of my friends who's like really into makeup, she's the one who told me about it, and she kind of said it's crazy because she wanted to go try stuff on and she goes, it kept being sold out.
Yes.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
And so now that there's this big Boots that's open in Covent Garden, where M&S used to be opposite the station, and like in the window they've got Fenty Beauty, and I'm like, well, that's going to be mobbed.
Yeah,
but I'm curious to try. I'm always curious to try different things, because like having something that doesn't make you look ashen, whether it's your face or whether it's your legs, is important.
Oh, absolutely. And that's there's another makeup brand, Pat McGrath, who's like a superstar.
I haven't heard of.
Oh my goodness, she's a superstar makeup artist who's, you know, like she's like the
UK
fashion
or America?
queen. She's British.
Okay.
And she has also just launched her foundations. She's a black British woman, and that is, I'd never ever buy foundation, but when she came out with it, because she's like a makeup legend, I was like, I'm gonna see it, and I got matched and I was like, whoa, it like just disappeared. And so it's interesting when people
that's so interesting,
focus on, say, like representing somebody as opposed to a token of it, because there are brands that have, and they've been, I mean, Fashion Fair was like the original makeup brand for women of
I'm
colour.
not super like into makeup, so none of these names are meaning anything to me.
I mean, Fashion Fair was like, this was in the 70s or 60s or 70s, when Eunice Johnson, she and her husband started Ebony magazine, which is a huge African American publication in the US.
I have heard of Ebony.
Yeah, so she started a makeup brand because she was like, well, lots of women of colour, lots of black women want to have, you know, like lovely makeup that matches their skin, and nobody's doing it, so I'll do it. But that was like kind of old school. I think they still exist, but this new wave of makeup, because a lot of times people would like have darker colours, but there'd be like 3, so there'd be about 40 shades of you know, light colours, and then there'd just be 3 random ones at the end. So if you were sort of like a lottery as to whether it was going to match or not. And I think the big thing with brands as like Fenty Beauty and with Pat McGrath is that they've said these colours that are darker are as equally important as the lighter colours, and so there's just more of a range.
And especially if you think about it just like logically, if you're gonna have people with different skin colours, especially when you then have you know, children from mixed race relationships, and then the next generation down, there's going to be a lot of different skin colors that need to be represented.
Yeah.
And so all it is people who are thinking about that, and thinking about the inclusivity and wanting people to be able to find something that matches themselves. It might seem like a little thing, but we're not talking about it from a cosmetic perspective. I mean, we're talking about it from that feeling of, wow, I matter.
Yeah, and it works, and I don't, you know, and I hope it does trickle down, and it has to a degree, because, you know, you can imagine like the young girls who can't afford, you know, like a department store priced foundation, but who want some cheap and cheerful stuff from Superdrug, and you hope that they can go in and find like a cheap foundation in their color as well, because I think now it's sort of more on the higher end of things, but it's all down the chain. Like, it shouldn't be sort of when you're an adult you get to have
no, absolutely.
So, and I think that's definitely trickling down, because people can see, I think companies can actually just see the financial ramifications of representation.
And Riz Ahmed made the point that in America, in films, the films that do the best in the box office are the films that are the most diverse.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because they tap into different sectors of the population.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that if we think about the world, like when I think about the world that I want to live in, it's a world where you see through somebody, and you see through to their heart and their soul, and you look at people, and you're seeking the things that bind you, rather than the things that divide you. And when you see difference, you approach it with more curiosity than fear.
Oh, absolutely. I love that, and I agree 100%. I remember going to visit one of my really good friends who's Japanese, and I'd never been to Japan before, and so you know, we were sort of on traditional futons, and we woke up in the morning, and I heard her mum in the room next door, and I was like, oh, what's she doing? And she was sort of at an altar and lighting some, I think it was like incense and stuff, and she was explaining to me that obviously in that tradition your ancestors are really important, so in the morning you sort of you know, pay your respects to them, and you
really
and you you know, so you have this beautiful I guess it's like an altar where you do that. And I remember thinking, I was like, oh, that's so interesting, because obviously in my culture, I'm Yoruba, your ancestors are considered really important. We don't necessarily do that specifically, but there is that thought of, you know, that collection between the lineage. And so I was like, that's really interesting that's, you know, across, and there's so many different cultures and religions where that does come into play. And so then you're like, that's an interesting...
It's again, seeing connections.
Exactly, that's an interesting connection between two completely different parts of the world, and yet there's a similarity there. You know, as opposed to looking at it and being like, oh, that's strange, but actually looking at what's underneath, what are the roots of it, and then seeing like, oh, actually, yeah, that makes sense. And I love that, and that's something that because probably similar to you, because I have grown up in so many places. I've got friends from all over the world.
Me too.
And one of the things that
My friends are like a walking Benetton advert.
Exactly. But one of the things that I love is seeing those similarities, and ultimately, I mean, people just want to be accepted, and they care about their families, and they want to, you know, have good lives and live in peace. That's what most people want, right? Regardless of where they're from or what religion they are. And so I feel like once you tap into that, then you sort of start to be like, yeah, actually, we want the same things.
Yeah, I've always said that I think people want to be seen and heard and understood and valued. You know, like at our core, I think we want to be seen, we want to belong, we want to feel like we matter to somebody, and that somebody really sees us for who we are and not just the trappings and the external. And I think that, you know, I find this all the time. When I remember when I saw do you know who Nick Vujicic is? He is Australian.
Okay.
He lives in Hawaii now. He was born with no arms and no legs. Okay. Very few people, it's a very small percentage of the world that are affected with that, and it just happens, you know. I can't remember what it's called. But anyway, this man is incredible. And he struggled a little bit when he was younger, and there was a point actually where he said that he wanted to commit suicide because he couldn't find a purpose for himself, and he felt alone. But he has gone on to, he's a speaker, and he has gone on to bring so much joy to people. And when you watch him and you see how enterprising he is as well, it expands your mind as to what is possible for everybody. And when I watch him, honestly, I can be watching him for sort of 10, 15, 20 seconds, and I will forget that he doesn't have arms and legs because I'm so riveted by who he is that like I don't even see the rest of it. And it's amazing. And then, you know, you see, because he does a lot of touring, and I've seen him speak in London. It was very, very emotional for me. I think I cried pretty much most of the talk because I was so, after having seen him on you know, like video, to then kind of actually see him live. There's something about the energy in the room when you see somebody live, right? And yeah, he definitely brings an incredible energy and grace to his talks. But I saw clips of this other little boy meeting him who also had no arms, no legs, and he was able to like look up and see a role model who looked like him, who then could, I think, for that little boy, it's like seeing a superhero.
Yeah, of course, right? Absolutely.
And so that's the power, I think, of, I guess this is why I'm also doing it. It's the power of using our voice, using our voice to share our story, to get to know somebody else, and to collectively, I mean, I learn best from people. I like seeing real people talk about things that have affected them, and I think that when we do that, then you'll have a situation where somebody will be watching you and they will see stuff that you've said or expressed, and they'll identify, it'll trigger something in them. And that's how we kind of change, I think, the world, is by helping, you know, everyone to recognize that there's a commonality underneath all of us.
Absolutely. I love that.
So I think we're coming to close. How would you like to close? Or any final thoughts? I mean, anything you'd like to invite people to do?
Oh goodness, that's a very very good question. I think it's really about being just a little bit more open. I think sometimes we think we're open, but we're closed in some way to something, and just having a think and being like, where could I be more open? Or what could I do to sort of show somebody that, like, I see them, you know, that they do matter. Because sometimes we take that for granted.
Yeah, I love that. Openness is one of my highest values, and I think it's the gateway to the greatest understanding that you can have, both of yourself and of other people. And so yes, I would invite you guys to do the same thing, to look at difference with curiosity and not fear, and to find the commonalities in people. And that means start having conversations. You know, have conversations with people that are different from you. When you're in a different country, really kind of talk to people who are local from that country. I always find, you know, when you do that, you kind of get the best tips of where to go anyway. And when you see people in London, because everybody comes and visits London, maybe go out of your way to share something about London that you love with them, and imagine the impression that you'll create with them. I think it'll sort of set off a domino effect, where then they'll go home wherever they're from. They'll be like, wow, Londoners are so friendly. Because I hear people say Londoners aren't, but that's not been my experience.
I think we're polite. I don't think people are necessarily friendly at like 9 a.m. on the tube.
On the tube, I think we need to break that on the tube, and that we need to start conversations more. But so Ade and I would just like to invite you to be more open and more curious, and to listen. So thanks so much for listening. Like with all of these, I would really love to hear your comments. what you thought. And Ade, thank you so much for doing this with me.
Thank you for having me.
So very happy. And love to collaborate with you in the future.
Amazing.
All right, take care. All right, bye guys.
Bye.